This was always a feminist YouTube channel. I mean, I went in that direction a long time ago. I know here on YouTube it's mostly a male platform. Sorry. I did want to say something though about all of this to distinguish myself. Um, when I say this, I don't claim allegiance to the mainstream school of feminist thought at all. Among other things, I'm fully on board with anti-carceral feminism. I'm much more of a radical with a prison abolitionist flavor of it that is beginning to question, concepts like abolition, concepts like carceral feminism and the fact that, feminism has too frequently referred to using the prison system as a solution to all problems. And that, every problem, if you're presented with a problem and all you have to solve things is the police, every problem starts to look like a nail. And unfortunately, that's just not, you need a diversity of tools to respond to things like male violence and, violence against women. I find myself critical of things like the Violence Against Women Act, not because I support violence against women, but because this same law has been weaponized against women. When you mandate arrest, often women are the ones that end up getting arrested during domestic violence calls. This is not what the law ultimately intended, at the end of the day. And it's really just it's disheartening to see the law backfire in the way that it ultimately has. I find myself against it, not because I don't think that the bill can be fixed. I think that it probably, with a bit of a scalpel or going over it, you could correct a lot of the major objections that somebody like me would raise to the Violence Against Women Act. I'm not saying repeal it. I'm just saying fix it. you know, there's some major issues with it, and there are feminists that are starting to wake up and realize this. I mean, I've always kind of tried to paint myself and say this. I am about the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This law started out with all the right intentions and ended up blowing up in people's faces, and I've always painted myself in that kind of way, like that thought coloring so much of my own feminism. I mean, why the hell else am I here except when people's best intentions lead them astray, but to try to help solve the problem when people's intent when there are the consequent unintended consequences to a piece of legislation. And what, like, could I call myself a feminist if I didn't, or characterize myself as this kind of feminist if I didn't, have those kinds of thoughts and weren't having that kind of thought. But I also wanted to characterize something ever since get to the Kotaku article that I was criticizing myself, which is just that the sentiment here is that the wrong shade of feminism won the culture war between like everything. You know, I know that in the early days there were a lot of people that were attacking and disparaging gynocentric feminism, but you should at least be able to hear out the message of what distinguishes us from the other camps and everything, and what we're seeing in the mode of feminist thought that we, that in the gynocentric camp would hail from, which is to say that, you know, it's not hard to look out there on society and see, for instance, that teachers are not underpaid in our society and underappreciated. It's not hard to also notice the way that our society pays NFL players a huge amount of money compared to what it will pay a teacher. Somebody like me, though, who hails from the "we need more femininity" perspective, would say that things should be flipped on their heads. Women are doing most of the teaching these days. That's independent of what the Bible says, and that women are not permitted to teach a man in the Bible, but they did. Most of my teachers growing up were women. I think, though, that when it comes to teachers, everything is completely backwards. We overvalue entertainment and undervalue education in our society. There is no, and this, more than anything, to me, signals that America is not even close to being a meritocracy. If it were, obviously, we would not be rewarding entertainment to the same extent that we were rewarding actual education. If this were actually a meritocracy, absurdities like this would not actually exist within our system. Other people who have tried to justify it will say that, the NFL brings in a ton of money. And I'm like, yeah, for a very, very small class of people, why everybody else remains poor. I mean, fuck. fuck this, the whole fucking thing. We really ought to be valuing education to a much greater extent than we ultimately have been. And what society needs is not, more masculinity. That isn't to say that masculinity is bad. It's just to say that, there's enough of it. You don't need more of it. I know that there's a cultural taboo against going against masculinity. I will say the following: I feel that masculinity can be, but isn't necessarily toxic. To say that you believe that there is a strain of thought about masculinity that can be toxic is not to say that you think masculinity is toxic. It's just to say that, there are certain interpretations of masculinity and what it means to be masculine that are toxic and force a lot of toxic expectations on men for being men. But moving aside, we cover both sides of this because I happen to be a guy who's channeling my own feminism here. I think that when it comes to the issue of women and, women's work and everything, that women's work is underappreciated and underpaid in our society, and really ought to be paid a lot better and rewarded a lot better than it actually is. Our society is looking at things via a very wrong priorities perspective. It has flipped everything on its head. It values the wrong thing. And America could be rightly characterized as the land of wrong priorities. You know, we really ought to be valuing education to a much greater extent than we are as a civilization. We are making a very brutal mistake on this front. So suffice to say, as a dissident and everything, there's a huge difference between me and like that Kotaku article, because that Kotaku article would say that, Jill is emotional and they're presenting this female character as, conforming to the stereotypes of women being more emotional than men. And I'm offended by that representation. And, you're sitting there as the viewer and you're thinking to yourself, why do we have to demonize being emotional in the first place? Like, why does our culture criticize that to the huge extent that it does? I mean, I know that people are said ultimately to make bad decisions when they're under the influence of emotion, but honestly, I look out there at women and I can list what I think are bad decisions that they have made. True to form. Yes, I can point at errors that they've made as a cohort. I know that they have not made the best decisions every single time, but I still feel like they have, as a cohort, like really started to kick our ass in academia, for instance. That women are getting all the fucking college degrees, so it's like, despite the fact that they are capable of making mistakes, it kind of feels like they've made less of them than we have as a cohort. We didn't really. I mean, I run a business now. I run an eBay store. I've been trying to sell on there, but it's like I haven't kept up with the ladies myself. The level of ambition that they have has just, completely blown me out of the water. I'm just trying to build something just to not be completely kicked out of the running, you know, because we got our asses kicked in academia, man, as a cohort. Like, man, like we're not doing so hot as far as that levels of educational attainment. Like, let's be honest and real about that one. The boys are in trouble. But looking out there as our society and everything, I can tell you that I honestly feel that, we undervalue women's work. We don't pay it like we really ought to as a society. And I think that that's the difference between me and some of these other feminists who are trying to be like, like I'm the strong feminist, and like I'm a woman and I don't have any emotions, and I want to fucking present that as if it's like meritorious and everything and great. I'm like, fuck this. Part of the reason why I like Jill from FF 16 is precisely that she is emotional. If women, you know, honestly, like some of the women that I like on this particular platform too, and their channels, like that I find myself really fond of. They have videos where they're watching anime and end up crying on video. And they get the tissues out and everything, and I'm just like, thumbs up. I like this about them. I find it attractive. So when you come at this with this Kotaku article like demonizing, and the thing is that I'm talking about this too, and talking about a future that women have that's like conceptual and not an attraction that's on the basis of appearance. So that's a big thing right there. I just wanted to point that out. But Kotaku making the article that it did about all that, like I couldn't disagree more, and I think that it's kind of a tragedy that the wrong shade of feminism seems to be getting the upper hand here in society. It would be nice to see a different shade that was closer to my own thinking on this one.